Well, good morning, everyone, and Happy New Year. I'm just really happy to be spending the first day of the year with everyone here. So, just happy you're here. If you're new here, welcome. If you've been here before, still welcome. And today, since it's the beginning of the year, I was thinking it would be good to talk about serenity, right? That's something we're all going to need at some point during the year. So I had once looked and I saw in the big book, there is actually a formula for serenity. So I'm going to get started now, and I hope this is helpful. So imagine this, two scenarios in the same household, my household. Scenario one of my teenagers asked me for something, and I know the right thing is to say no, but I want to avoid an argument, so I just say yes. Great. Argument avoided. But 3 days later, when this child is 5 minutes late coming home, I blow up at her for being inconsiderate and irresponsible, and then I'm mad at myself for overreacting. Scenario two, same teenager asked me for something, and I know the right thing is to say no. I want to avoid an argument, but I say no anyway. And when that child complains and tells me I'm the world's worst mom, I hold my ground calmly and go do my fear inventory. And 3 days later, when she's 5 minutes late, I remind myself she's usually on time and give her grace and nicely ask how her evening was, and I have serenity. Same scenario, but different reactions. Why? Why do I sometimes create calamity while at other times I can have serenity, even if other people are creating chaos? And I think the answer is found in like the most brilliant formula in the big book on page 68. We are in the world to play the role that he assigns, he meaning God. Just to the extent we do as we think he would have us and humbly rely on him, does he enable us to match calamity with serenity. So, for all you math brain people out there, I think it goes like this: A units of obedience to what I think God wants, plus B units of trusting him. So it's like A units of surrender plus B units of trust equals AB units of serenity. Notice that the extent of calamity isn't even in the formula. It's my trust and my surrender that determines how much serenity I'll have. So if I don't have serenity, even in the midst of calamity, I'm either not doing what I think God would have me, not surrendering, or not humbly relying on him, not trusting. So today I would like to just go into detail on this formula for serenity, trust and surrender. So I think trust has to come first, right? By and large, I can't surrender without trust. Think about it. That's how it goes in many areas of our lives. We would be kind of, it wouldn't make sense to surrender to something or someone who we don't trust. So, a number of years ago, I had some severe pain in my right side. I tried to take care of it myself with pain relievers, but it didn't get better. You could say I was powerless over the pain. I was on a plane ride from across the country, and I was actually scared they might have to make an emergency landing. That's how bad the pain was. And that, I guess we could say, is pretty unmanageable. I clearly had a problem that I needed outside help with. So I went to my doctor, and she said, Dr. So and so is chief of surgery at Valley Hospital. Go see him. I trusted her. So I went to Dr. So and so, who took out my appendix, and the problem was solved. Based on my doctor's opinion and my consultation with Dr. So and so, I can't remember his name, I came to believe that Dr. So and so could restore me to health. And I made a decision to allow him to like cut and remove a body part of mine when I was anesthetized. For those couple of hours, you could say I turned my life over to Dr. So and so. Okay, well, now we all know that I have no appendix, but let's get back to the big book. Let's define the word trust. The dictionary says to trust means to believe in the reliability, truth, ability, or strength of someone or something. For our purposes, God. So, how do we come to believe that God is reliable, truthful, able, and strong? Well, the first way the way we do anything is through research, even though we may not think of it that way. Our research takes the form of learning about what's happened to other people who've trusted God. That's the main reason we tell our stories, right? Page 29 of the Big Book tells us that in the personal stories, each individual describes from his own point of view the way he established his relationship with God. It's the whole point of working these steps. And then page 50 tells us that the founders of AA all agreed on one thing, right? Imagine getting two addicts to agree on anything. But here they're saying that 100 of them agreed. This is what they agreed on. On one proposition, however, these men and women are strikingly agreed. Every one of them has gained access to and believes in a power greater than himself. This power, and they capitalize the word power, so meaning God, this power has in each case accomplished the miraculous, the humanly impossible. As a celebrated American statesman put it, let's look at the record. So my evidence is really all of you. If all of you tell me that once you believed in the reliability, truth, ability, and strength of God, your obsession with food began to be lifted, well, that would certainly be fertilizer for my trust. That's why there's all those stories in the Big Book and why people share their stories at meetings to prove to newcomers that God is trustworthy. But because we're the kind of people we are, there's generally another hurdle we have to get through, right? If I tell you that Dr. So-and-so is a great doctor and can take care of your appendix, you'll probably have no trouble believing me. But if I tell you that God can take care of your eating problem or your alcohol problem, well, that's a little harder. Here's why. So page 55 of the Big Book says, deep down in every man, woman, and child is the fundamental idea. However, listen to this next line. It may be obscured by calamity, by pomp, by worship of other things. So when I tell you about like Dr. So-and-so's great surgical skills, you probably don't have any kind of block that would prevent you from calling on him if you had appendicitis. But when it comes to God, the Big Book tells us we typically have three blocks: calamity, pomp, and worship of other things. And these things obscure my belief in God, much like a cataract would obscure my vision. We can call them like the three soul cataracts. The first one, calamity. So that's one that Bill Wilson had. On page 11, he talks about wars, burnings, and the devastation he'd seen in Europe during World War I. In fact, he said the devil seemed to be the boss of the universe. I mean, that's a pretty strong prejudice, pretty strong cataract there. So his belief in God was obscured by calamity. How did he get through that? Well, Ebby, the man who carried the message to him, didn't argue with him. He just said God had done for him what he could not do for himself. And like thinking about that, I realized that when I say to God, he shouldn't allow human trafficking or cancer or my children not to take my wonderful advice, what I'm really saying is that I'm smarter than God, right? On my wedding day, I wanted sunshine, prayed for sunshine, but it was pretty much almost like a hurricane. It was pretty bad. Well, if God answered every bride's prayer for no rain on her wedding day, there would be no food supply because no crops could grow. So I need to realize when I'm saying God should do X, Y, Z, what I'm really saying is that if I were God, I would arrange the world so X, Y, Z would or wouldn't happen. And I have two master's degrees, but I am so underqualified for the job of God. I've learned that the hard way. So the next thing that obscures our belief in God is pomp, ostentatious boastfulness, or vanity. It's really me thinking I'm good enough that I don't need God, that I can handle things on my own. Well, if that's my issue, all I really need to do is go back and ask myself, how well did I handle food on my own? Right? I can't even manage a cup of blueberries on my own. How well did I manage my job or my marriage or the big one, my parenting? Chances are, if I could handle all those things on my own, I would not be spending time on Zoom meetings and pre-pandemic in like church basements at anonymous fellowship meetings. My track record was abysmal, and like, please God, never let me think I could handle things on my own. The final block is worship of other things. Well, I have loads of examples here. When I was in college, I had a boyfriend who I turned into an idol. If he was mad at me, I was depressed. Happy with me, I was over the moon. Clearly not a healthy relationship, and thankfully we parted ways. But when I care too much about what any other person thinks, whether that's my spouse, my child, my boss, I'm in trouble. Or if I care about other things too much, my job, my possessions, my status, and here's a big one for me, my right to leisure time, as much leisure time as I want, then I'm in trouble. I've made that person or thing in an idol. So those are some of the blocks mentioned on page 55, but like take heart. It says deep down in every man, woman, and child is the fundamental idea of God. That's my favorite line in the big book. It's such a beautiful thought. It says that God planted in me, when he created in me, in all of us, the fundamental idea of himself. It's like when he created us, he said, I want them to know me and to love me and to know how much I love them. So along with two eyes, two ears, two kidneys, two lungs, one stomach, one heart, I'm going to make the knowledge of me a fundamental part of them. Remember how our book says God does not make too hard terms with those who seek him? How could he? The knowledge of him is planted inside of us. We just have to water it. Okay, so now we've cleared away the blocks. And if anyone wants to go like more into detail about the things that block us, in the chapter We Agnostics, it gives about half a dozen things. And I did a recording on We Agnostics Part 1 where I go in depth about the prejudices that can block us from God. So let's say we get it. We trust God, right? We believe that God's strong, capable, cares about us. That's a great start and a necessary start because we don't get any power until we trust. Admitting we're powerless gets us no power. Getting a sponsor gets us no power. Trust is the beginning of our infusion of power, like a pick line of grace going straight to our hearts. And on page 46, it says, as soon as we admit the possible existence of a creative intelligence, a spirit of the universe underlying the totality of things, we began to be possessed of a new sense of power and direction, provided we took other simple steps. Like that's so cool. We begin getting power when we begin having faith. How come? Like, what's the correlation between power and faith? Well, I think it's because faith is the currency in the spiritual world. In the physical world, if I want something, I go to the store and I hand the cashier money or a credit card. Money is the currency in the physical world that allows me to get food, clothes, a tank of gas, right? But I can't hand God a $50 bill or my American Express card and ask for power. The currency in the spiritual world is faith, generally activated by prayer. Faith or trust is actually currency in the spiritual world and gets things done. Think about our step 2, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. In what other illness does anyone care what we believe, right? If a child has pneumonia, they don't have to believe that penicillin can restore them to health. The mom gives them the penicillin, they don't know it, they get better. But we have to really believe that God will restore us to sanity. So trust is half of our equation. The sentence we read before, page 46, said, once we believe, we get power and direction, provided we take other simple steps. And the next step is surrender, step 3, which is an action step. If I'm a diabetic and I trust that insulin has helped you, and even come to believe that insulin will help me, but I don't inject it into my arm, the fact that I believe that I trust that it works is useless. In the AA 12 and 12, page 72, it says that we could actually have earnest religious beliefs which remained barren because we were still trying to play God ourselves. So I need to add surrender to my trust. Now there's a temptation to say, okay, God, I'm willing to believe. Now prove yourself by removing my food obsession, making my kids listen to me, and heal all my sick relatives. But God isn't a genie in a bottle. And if I'm asking God to prove himself to me, then I'm still playing God. So my favorite example of this is in the exchange between two men who were both in an insane asylum. It's written by the minister's son, right, who we talk about in chapter 4, and is told from his point of view. His whole story is called Our Southern Friend, and I'm reading now from page 215. So this is the minister's son talking. I get out of bed and go to the man's room. He's reading. I must ask you a question, I say to the man. How does prayer fit into this thing? Well, he answers, you've probably tried praying like I have. When you've been in a jam, you said, God, please do this or that. And if it turned out your way, that was the last of it. And if it didn't, you said, there isn't any God, or he hasn't done anything for me. Is that right? Yes, the minister's son replies. That isn't the way, the other man continued. The thing I do is to say, God, here I am, and here are all my troubles. I've made a mess of things and can't do anything about it. You take me in all my troubles and do anything you want with me. Does that answer your question? Yes, it does, the minister's son answered. This is what he said. I return to bed. It doesn't make sense. Suddenly, I feel a wave of utter hopelessness sweep over me. I am in the bottom of hell, and there a tremendous hope is born. It might be true. I tumble out of bed onto my knees. I know not what I say, but slowly, a great peace, I feel lifted up. I believe in God. I crawl back into bed and sleep like a child. And as we know from reading his story, he never drank again. So, what was the key here? He surrendered his whole life. He gave God all of it. God could take his alcohol obsession, his marriage, his job, everything. Do I do that? Do you do that? Do we do that? Do we give God everything? Or do we say, God, take care of my food, but I'll take care of my own taxes, look the other way, right? We have to give God everything. But we have to admit, like, okay, what does that actually mean? When I surrender, do I sit around like a lump of clay expecting God to like do my grocery shopping and shampoo my hair? Well, of course not. Surrender is defined as abandoning oneself entirely. But I think for us addicts, I would tweak that definition a bit to say surrender is doing the right thing and leaving the results up to God. So, on a practical level, what does that look like? So, generally, we have goals, and the goals are often good ones like raising respectful children, get my husband to stop smoking, raising kids who go to church. But they're my goals and they're outcome oriented. It's radically different when my goal is simply to do God's will. Makes life a lot easier. Then it doesn't matter if my husband ever stops smoking, how my kids turn out, anything like that. So let's say my goal is to have kids who go to church even when they're out of my house. And I try my hardest and I do the right thing. But once my kids are out of my house, they don't go to church. Well, I'll get resentful and fearful and manipulative and start nagging them to get my goal. But if my goal is simply to do God's will, I may raise them the exact same way, still take them to church, teach them the right things, but I'm less likely to get angry, fearful, and frustrated because I'm not focused on the results, having kids who go to church, only on my obedience to God. So, in other words, the goal shifts from achieving something, even if that something is good, to simply doing God's will. We're out of the results business. That's what surrender is. So as of now, I have two grown kids. One usually goes to church, the other doesn't yet. And I have total serenity over whether they do or don't go. Not my business. God is not going to judge me based on my kids' church attendance. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges I've had with surrender and that we may have. So a big one was when I was single. I didn't get married until I was 39. I'd had a pretty wild past. But then in my 30s, I started believing that God wanted me to be chaste until I got married. Chaste, Chaste, not Chased. And I felt fear because, like, who would want to marry me with the sex ideal that I had? I thought I wouldn't be happy unless I got married. One might even say I had a demand to be married. But the AA 12 and 12 says on page 76, no peace is to be had unless we can find a means of reducing these demands. The difference between a demand and a simple request is plain to anyone. So it was okay for me to want a husband, but not to demand it, and certainly not to feel like God owed it to me. Entitlement is a big way to block God. By the way, my husband and I recently celebrated our 25-year wedding anniversary. But even if I were sitting here in my 60s and single, like some of my friends are, it is possible to be surrendered and happy anyway. Another area that's often difficult for us to surrender, especially at the beginning, is our food plan. Even once we get abstinent and start working the steps, there are often times when we need to make new surrenders. So whether at the beginning or years in, we may have to do what Dr. Bob did. Page 181, he says, I used to get terribly upset when I saw my friends drink and knew I could not. But I schooled myself to believe that though I once had the same privilege, I had abused it so frightfully it had been withdrawn. Notice the absence of self-pity here. He just surrendered his right and he used his intellect to help him. I have a sponsee who told me she felt inspired to have a breakup conversation with unhealthy food, much like she'd do with an unhealthy boyfriend. And she got relief from that, and she's been abstinent now 4 years. So by far, for me, the biggest challenge to surrender has been with my children. I've had to surrender their physical health, their mental health, their education, my dreams for their future, my hopes for their religious practices, all the things that the big book would lump together as my little plans and designs. Surrender means I try to raise them right and leave the results up to God. And by the way, the best advice I ever got in parenting was as much as possible, try to keep a good relationship, because once they're a certain age, I can't control them. All I can do is influence them. And the only way to have influence is to have a good relationship. Um, so circling back to where we started, if I don't have serenity, I can't use the excuse that there's chaos or calamity all around me. The early AAs went off to war, and I can't think of anything more chaotic with more calamity than being in a war, and they stayed sober. So I need to look at where in any situation I'm either not trusting God and or where I'm not surrendered. And when I do trust and when I do surrender, well, that's when I can expect not only serenity, but so much more. Page 100, my second favorite line in the big book, says, the things which came to us when we put ourselves in God's hands were better than anything we could have planned. Follow the dictates of a higher power, and you will presently be living in a new and wonderful world, no matter what your present circumstances. So I'm thinking about my kids now. So my son, who, again, when he finished high school, at one point I said, you need to get out of this house, thinking that he would just say, I'm sorry, after doing, being very difficult to deal with. He went and he stayed at his best friend's for 6 weeks. Um, Now we have a really good relationship. A week from Sunday, He goes for 5 months of military training. He's an infantry officer. Infantry means like guns. He's like in charge, he's going to be in charge of leading people with guns. And then later this year, he's getting deployed to like a hard deployment. And he asked me, "Are you afraid?" Because now we have a really good relationship and we talk. And I said, "No, believe you're the safest place anyone could be, right smack dab in the center of God's will. Safest place to be." My daughter, who at one point said, "You're never going to see me again," um, after we left her house, after spending Christmas with her, 15 minutes after we left, she called and said, "I miss you guys already." She calls me pretty much every day, and I mean, I have great relationships beyond anything I ever could have dreamed. Remember, my plans and dreams are limited by my imagination, but God's imagination is limitless. And the new and wonderful world that we can live in, no matter what our present circumstances, I think Bill Wilson described that on page 8, where he says, we can know happiness, peace, and usefulness in a way of life that is incredibly more wonderful as time passes. That means like our recovery, our serenity can be progressive, incredibly more wonderful as time passes. And we can begin to enter this world, this fourth dimension, when we begin to trust and surrender. So I want to close by reading a story. Some of you may have heard me read before, but I think it's perfect for New Year's Day. And I think it perfectly describes a life lived in trust and surrender. Dominique, a lean, muscular 6 feet 2 inches, always wearing a navy blue beret, learned at age 54 that he was dying of inoperable cancer. He was a monk, and with his community's permission, he moved to a poor neighborhood in Paris and took a job as night watchman at a factory. Returning home every morning at 8 a.m., he would go directly to a little park across the street from where he lived and sit down on a wooden bench. Hanging around the park were marginal people, drifters, winos, has-been, dirty old men who ogled the girls passing by. Dominique never criticized, scolded, or reprimanded them. He laughed, told stories, shared his candy, accepted them just as they were. From living so long out of the inner sanctuary, he gave off a peace, a serene sense of self-possession, and a hospitality of heart that caused cynical young men and defeated old men to gravitate toward him like bacon toward eggs. His simple witness lay in accepting others as they were without questions and allowing them to make themselves at home in his heart. Dominique was the most non-judgmental person I have ever known. He loved with the heart of God. One day, when the ragtag group of rejects asked him to talk about himself, Dominique gave them a thumbnail description of his life. Then he told them with quiet conviction that God loved them tenderly and stubbornly, that he had come for rejects and outcasts just like them. His witness was credible because the word was enfleshed on his bones. Later, one old timer said the dirty jokes, vulgar language, and leering at girls just stopped. One morning, Dominique failed to appear on his park bench. The men grew concerned. A few hours later, he was found dead on the floor of his Coldwater flat. He died in the obscurity of a Parisian slum. Dominique never tried to impress anybody, never wondered if his life was useful or his witness meaningful. He never felt he had to do something great for God, but he did keep a journal. It was found shortly after his death in the drawer of the nightstand by his bed. His last entry is one of the most astonishing things I have ever read. All that is not the love of God has no meaning for me. I can truthfully say that I have no interest in anything but the love of God. If God wants it to, my life will be useful through my word and witness. If God wants it to, my life will bear fruit through my prayers and sacrifices. But the usefulness of my life is God's concern, not mine. it would be indecent of me to worry about that. And with that, I will pass.